person and virtually. My name is Joel Lee. I teach in the anthropology and sociology department. And I have the good fortune to be, along with some wonderful colleagues, part of the faculty lecture committee this year. No doubt each of you has already memorized or inscribed in your calendars the entire faculty lecture series for the semester, but in case not, I thought I would just advertise some of the upcoming speakers you can look forward to in the coming weeks. So next week, we will have a wonderful presentation on a novel in progress by Nelly Rosario, followed a week later by Lee Yu, then Tim Lebetsky, and finally, right before spring break, Lama Nassif. So we hope to see you many times in the weeks ahead. Today, it's my great pleasure to introduce Nicolas Howe, who is an associate professor of environmental studies, also the director of the Center for Environmental Studies and an affiliate in anthropology and sociology. His first book, co-authored with Philip Smith, is called Climate Change as Social Drama, Global Warming in the Public Sphere. Next came a book entitled Landscapes of the Secular, Law, Religion, and American Sacred Space. His interests in landscapes as products of human work, imagination, and contestation has, if I'm not mistaken, led him to an adjacent set of questions about riverscapes and water flows more generally as people have imagined and shaped them in the past and in the present. Leading, I think, to material that he'll be presenting today under the title Reanimating Postindustrial Rivers, the Ethics of Dam Removal. So please join me in welcoming Nicolas Howe.
Thanks, everyone. I feel like I don't need a microphone, but I've been told that in order to be heard online, I have to have it, and that I need to stand near what is apparently feeding back over here. So I think to avoid that horrific sound, I'm going to turn it off. I have not given a talk in person since 2019. This is really, really like a joyful occasion for me. I'm really excited. Thank you to the lecture committee and to the organizers of this event. Thank you to Joel, who we are all extremely fortunate now to have as a tenured member of the Williams College faculty. And also thanks to the river restoration community in Maine, particularly the members of Upstream, which is an environmental advocacy group that's been incredibly generous with their time and insight over the past several years. What I'm going to be presenting today is a small piece of a book that I'm working on based on field work that I've been doing in Maine for the past few years. I have yet to publish anything out of this research, so the usual disclaimers about works in progress apply, and the enthusiastic and trepidatious invitations for feedback. So what does it mean to bring a river back to life? Restoration, revival, renewal, reanimation, resurgence, resurrection, revitalization, renaissance, rebirth. In many parts of the world, particularly in the wealthy post-industrial world, particularly in North America and Europe, we're so accustomed to hearing terms like these that we don't ever pause to ask, what is a living river anyway? What's a living ecosystem? And why should we care? As best as I can tell, I'm not a historian, but the trope of the living river is something that gained traction in the American environmental community in the 1950s and 1960s. When rivers and dams, and you can think here of the Colorado River, Glen Canyon, the burning Cuyahoga River, we're at the center of American environmental politics. As the writer John McPhee famously wrote in his 1972 profile of the Sierra Club leader Dave Brower, Encounters with the Archdruid, in the view of conservationists, there is something special about dams, something as conservation problems go, that is disproportionately and metaphysically sinister. The outermost circle of the devil's world seems to be a moat filled mainly with DDT. Next to it is a moat of burning gasoline. Within that is a ring of pinheads, each covered with 1 million people, and so on past phalanx bulldozers and bicuspid chainsaws into the absolute epicenter of hell on earth, where stands a dam. The conservation movement is a mystical and religious force, and possibly the reaction to dams is so violent because rivers are the ultimate metaphors of existence, and dams destroy rivers. Humiliating nature, a dam is evil, placed and solid. Now, whatever you think about McPhee's characterization of environmentalism as a religious movement, I think his interpretation of dams is entirely accurate. Really, from the very beginning of the wilderness preservation movement, really going back to the 19th century, the notion that dams kill rivers has been pretty much axiomatic. And yet today, hardly anyone is building dams in America. In fact, we're tearing them down faster than we are building them. And for many environmentalists, this is one of the very few feel-good stories in a decidedly feel-bad world. Our rivers are cleaner than they have been for many, many decades. Throughout the Northeast, deindustrialization and regulation, and in some cases, dam removal, have transformed terribly polluted, fetid rivers into vibrant ecosystems. And you can just go down to the Hoosick River to see what that's all about. There's the Hudson, the Charles, the Elwha in the Pacific Northwest, the Thames in the UK, and perhaps the largest laboratory for this experiment in restoration is the state of Maine. So what? I mean, it's nice that you can go down to streams that didn't have fish like this and see them now, but why should people care? What's the point of ecological restoration if it's not materially benefiting ordinary people? Should we even be talking about destroying dams when we so desperately need more clean energy? And why should people in struggling mill towns support efforts to revive rivers that no longer enliven their own economies? So I set out to answer this question a few years ago, and I'll admit that what I expected was pretty much what you're trained to expect these days in the environmental humanities and social sciences. I'm a cultural geographer, and what I was primed to expect was a bunch of nature worshiping, out of touch, upper class environmentalists and hungry real estate developers conspiring to turn these post-industrial landscapes into playgrounds for outdoorsy professionals, tourists, and so on. So a little bit of mysticism and a lot of money. I also expected to find kind of culturally tone deaf scientists, maybe rather self-righteous, who cared more about fish than about people, and who saw everything since the Industrial Revolution as one long slide towards apocalypse. And those people do exist. I have met them. But in my ethnographic field work in Maine, among the people who are working to restore these rivers, I met very, very few, if any. On the contrary, what I learned from spending time with in particular grassroots river restoration activists, was that this kind of anti-modernist, anti-urban, Manichaean moral logic that McPhee identified in the 1970s is really losing its grip on parts of the American environmental imagination, at least in some places. So what I've seen emerging in Maine and in other parts of New England, albeit on a small scale, gives me hope that our moral and political conceptions of ecological health are changing, and for the better. So as we are settling into this new geological epoch called the Anthropocene, I see evidence that people are learning to approach the immensely problematic and important project of ecological restoration with a new kind of humility and realism and open-mindedness. So to show you why, let me take you to a place that I find utterly fascinating. This probably does not strike you as a particularly natural looking or vibrant place. Try to imagine it on a perfect, beautiful, sunny May day. Birds everywhere, the trees are in bloom, and hundreds of thousands of tiny fish are boiling in the river, turning it silver. Took these pictures in 2019. I'm visiting the Benton Falls Dam, what we're looking at here on the Sebasticook River. It's a tributary of the Kennebec River, which is the focal point of my book. And I'm here to see what the first major dam removal in American history has produced, which is the largest run of river herring in America and probably the world. These river herring are alewives, mostly with some blueback herring mixed in. There are a handful of men up to their knees in the river. They're netting the herring. They're loading them into dinghies and then loading these dinghies, bringing these dinghies over to the bank and loading the fish into crates and loading the crates into trucks. Downstream of the rapids, there are schools of striped bass and some northern pike, smallmouth bass. They're gorging themselves on the alewives. You hear the phrase, everything eats alewives, a lot in the river restoration community. Just 100 yards downstream of here, there are literally dozens of bald eagles flying, hanging out in trees, eating. This time of year on the Sebasticook, you can see as many as 50 eagles in a day just walking or canoeing. That's more than existed in the entire state of Maine just a few decades ago. And some say it's the largest gathering of eagles outside of Alaska in the United States. So at the far side of the dam, there's a giant elevator. You can see it in this picture. It's that gray structure over on the left. And it is scooping up the fish, lifting them up mechanically, and sending them through a sluiceway. They swim past a viewing window before heading upstream to spawn. In 2019, year I visited, 5,579,901 alewives swam past this window. And in the period from 1838 to 1999, 0 fish swam up the Sebasticook. So my guide today is this guy, Nate Gray. He is a bear-like biologist for the state of Maine, for the Department of Marine Resources. And Nate's showing me around, and he really wants me to know right off the bat that the word ecology is derived from the Greek word oikos, or household. And I decide I'm going to show off, and so I say, economy too. Exactly, he says. They mean the same thing. We're all in the house, whether we like it or not. So Nate's been involved in the restoration of the Kennebec watershed for a long time. He calls it the largest and most successful fisheries restoration in the world. I don't know how to quantify that, but it's possible. Really, it all started back in 1999 when this dam, the Edwards Dam in Augusta, Maine, which is on the Kennebec, was taken down. It was a long struggle between environmental groups and the dam owner. And when it happened, it was big news. There were about 1,000 people gathered on the banks. The Secretary of Interior gave a speech. There were lots and lots of reporters, including John McPhee. This dam was about 20 feet tall and 900 feet long, and it had blocked the flow of the Kennebec since 1837. Almost single-handedly destroying what were probably the most abundant runs of salmon, sturgeon, shad, striped bass, lamprey, eel, river herring in Maine. This was a first in many ways. It was the first active hydroelectric dam to be decommissioned by the US government against the wishes of its owners. It was the first removal of a dam that spanned the entire main stem of a major river. And it was the first time environmentalists had successfully argued that fish migration mattered more than industry. So back to Benton Falls, Nate takes me around. We see all kinds of amazing wildlife. There are mink eating the alewives. There are ospreys flying around. There are Baltimore orioles. Everything is gathering in this one spot for this orgy of eating. And the alewife harvesters are working, bending and scooping, loading up the trucks, taking those trucks down to the coast where they will sell the alewives as lobster bait. Nate says that he wants to show me something really special. So we hop in his car. It's the only car I've ever been in that's dirtier than my own. And he takes me down to a little feeder creek and wants to show me this structure, which is a little fish ladder that some local high school students made to help the alewives upstream. Nate's trying to explain the ecological significance of alewives to me. He says they're like the nails in the house. Okay, without them, everything falls apart. And it's true, pretty much everything in the Gulf of Maine depends on these little fish. And their numbers have declined by something like 98, maybe even 99% over the past 200 years or so. So to restore them, many scientists think would be to also help restore cod, salmon, many other species that are really economically valuable. So Nate's trying to tell me that unlike the electricity that was once produced by that dam, unlike money, they possess a special kind of ecological value. I can eat those, he says, pointing to the crates of herring. I can't eat 5.1 megawatts of electricity. And then later in the day, he really wants to hammer this home. So he holds up a $1 bill and puts it in my face and says, you can't eat this. You can eat fish. So he's actually kind of famous for his aphoristic and philosophical way of speaking. I found a quote from him where he took a reporter to this place and said, what you are looking at here is a change in the mindset of humanity toward what wealth is. So Nate speaks very slowly and deliberately in a kind of pan-maritime accent. It's a combination of a Maine accent where he's lived most of his life, but also Gloucester where he grew up. He's very good at communicating with the local community. Kids get it, he told me. They understand the intrinsic beauty, and that was his word, of this ecosystem. There's an artistic voice that's needed here to reveal the beauty of this world. The only way to convey this beauty to the public is through storytelling, he says. It isn't an equation, it's a story, like this place. On our way back to the lift, he stops at an 18th century church to show me the bell, which was lying in the yard for repairs. And he goes up and taps it with his penknife and says, ironically, "Let us pray." It says Paul Revere on the bell, the hero of America's founding myth. And he thinks it's funny. But then he turns to me with a very sincere smile and says, "This river is a form of church. The animals in the river are at church, and all they know is the truth." Now, many of you probably know that dam removal is having kind of a moment right now, at least in North America and Europe. One of the few pieces of big good news in the last couple of years was that the government had agreed to remove a series of dams on the Klamath River. Unfortunately, a couple of weeks ago, that was cast into doubt by some federal regulators. But there has been a big emphasis on restoring salmon runs as a form of environmental justice to rectify the injustice caused by dams. And indeed, there's emerging historical work on New England showing that colonists actually used dams deliberately to starve indigenous people upstream. These kinds of, and this is just a book by a wonderful sociologist on the Klamath and their relationship with the river, but the Karuk and their relationship with the Klamath River. These are hailed as major milestones, not just in ecological restoration, but kind of restorative environmental justice. The Penobscot in Maine had a similar, the largest dam removal in history. A series of dams removed in the Penobscot, took many, many years, millions of dollars. And people hail it as a really hopeful instance of indigenous communities working with environmental groups, working with industry, working with government. In many of these communities, dams are seen as part of an ongoing form of settler colonialism. But in most of New England and in most of the North Atlantic world, where rivers have been dammed and diverted over and over and over again, the reasons for removal are less clear. There isn't a strong environmental justice argument. Who benefits from runs of alewife like these in Plymouth's Town Brook? Well, perhaps some fishers in Maine anyway. They're not going to harvest them here. Outdoors people, some chambers of commerce. We're surrounded in New England everywhere by the ruins of a hydraulic civilization. Everything is built around rivers and dams. You can just walk around Williamstown. There are ruins of big dams on the Green River right off campus. They're everywhere. What do we do with them? And why should we do anything? So typically the main reason you hear from scientists is to restore river health. But what counts as a healthy river is far from clear, either scientifically or socially. It's a really ambiguous concept, ecosystem health. After spending a number of years walking around places like this place in particular is the sort of focal point of my work, Paperboard Dam in Gardner, Maine. Spent a lot of time just hanging out here with people who are trying to take that dam down. After spending so much time with them, I see river health in a different way. And if you'll indulge me, I'd like to suggest that a healthy river is actually a happy river. It's a river that generates happiness. And I don't mean happiness in the usual hedonic sense of a subjective state of pleasurable feelings, but happiness as flourishing, happiness as what the ancient Greeks would have called eudaimonia. Typically translated as human flourishing, but also seen increasingly as a multi-species process. So for Aristotle in particular, happiness meant living life in accordance with the virtues. It was very much an active verb. It was about what one did, not what one felt. To be happy was to act virtuously. And I didn't go into this work with any preformed theoretical agenda, but I just started to hear so much talk about self-reliance, freedom, humility, generosity, reciprocity, practical knowledge, respect for tradition. And it drew me towards the field of virtue ethics, or the study of virtue ethics, which has been a really prominent aspect of environmental ethics in recent years. It also drew me to feminist eco-philosophy, science and technology studies, multi-species anthropology. I'm a geographer, so I get to just dabble and be a magpie. That's the whole reason for the field's existence. And I started to draw together a kind of pattern or see patterns in a story about people imagining these kinds of places as flourishing places, as happy places. The problem is that the restorationists who are working on these projects don't have a ready language to describe these kinds of values. It's really difficult to make these kinds of goals intelligible when all we talk about at the end of the day is, essentially cost-benefit analysis or the ecosystem services that this might provide. That's not what they're interested in. We boil it down to recreational values or spiritual values or aesthetic values. But these concepts really don't capture what is a much more comprehensive and historically rooted vision of humans and non-humans flourishing in concert. For a river to be fully alive in their eyes, it has to churn with scaly silver things. And this is why places like Benton Falls, I think, perform such an important ethical and political function. They embody what an increasing number of conservation scientists have embraced coming out of environmental ethics, such as eudaimonic values of humans and non-humans flourishing in a shared oikos, as Nate would have it. And unlike either intrinsic values or instrumental utilitarian values, eudaimonic values are inherently relational. They're about the relationships that exist among species, including ourselves. And it's kind of amazing, actually. This notion has really gained traction in international environmental policy. You may have heard of IPBES, which is the, I can never remember what it stands for, Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. It's sort of like the IPCC of biodiversity. And this comes from them. They are now acknowledging that we need to move beyond ecosystem services, beyond a utilitarian framework, to talk about a range of values, including relational values, like sense of place, cultural identity, social cohesion, and so forth. And this is in response to, decades of failures by conservationists to acknowledge these kinds of things. Now, the key virtues that I've noticed people talking about with people like Nate are self-reliance, reciprocity, and autonomy. So when dams are removed, rivers are freed to run naturally, whatever that means. When rivers are freed, fish are freed to run from sea to source. When fish are freed, people are free to support themselves, both materially and culturally. Should they choose to harvest those fish, They are free to feed themselves and profit from a renewable, perennially abundant resource, one that sustains an entire coastal ecosystem. Should they choose to simply observe those fish on their migration, they experience a kind of joy and intersubjective freedom, a moral intimacy with something that is profoundly other. The famous anthropologist Anna Singh has shown in her ethnography of Matsutake mushroom pickers in the Pacific Northwest, in her book, The Mushroom at the End of the World, she talks about freedom as a multi-species relational virtue. It's an emergent property of relations among fish, in my case, in her case, mushrooms, water, people, technology. And the nodes in these networks are specific, meaning-rich places, storied places, sites of social memory, of spectacle, and of social conflict. Now, Nate said these places don't tell stories. He said these places are stories. And as a geographer, I really appreciated that distinction, because place for us is something that gathers together the past and the present, the human and the non-human, nature and culture into a unified experiential whole. It has agency in social life. And so freedom in this sense is something that you feel in a place, and it may be something that you can even learn from a place. But in a sense, it belongs to the river itself, to the place itself, not to any individual actor. It's a relational property. You're all familiar with the fact, with the sort of archetypal image of salmon running up rivers, right? In Alaska with grizzly bears hanging out at rapids, catching them with their teeth, and the idea of the salmon as a kind of emblem of freedom. But they're also an emblem of the aristocracy, of wilderness with all the problems that go along with that idea, purity, and so forth. The alewife are not like that at all. So one elderly resident of Gardner, Maine told me there's something to eat in the Depression. They stunk up the house when you cooked them, and they were filled with bones. Restoration advocates often mention colonial era laws that reserved a portion of the alewife harvest to widows and the poor. And most know that people use them to fertilize their fields. So here in central Maine is a working class group of people, one activist told me. They work hard every day, and I just think they see the return of the alewives and how hard they're working to get upstream is connected to their lives, and how they're persistent and how they hit roadblocks, but they don't give up. I think that's really probably part of the Yankee kind of stoic personality. They're the everyday fish, and we're the everyday people, you know? Another guy from, as he put it, a really poor background in a southern Maine mill town said to me, "We're not going back to that pure trout stream thing. It's not going to happen. But we can have something good. And it can be the natural environment embedded in our communities. We don't have to be at war with the natural environment. We can bring it in, and it can be beautiful, and it can enrich people's lives, and it can make the community stronger." This is someone whose father and grandfather all worked in mills powered by dams that had destroyed the fish runs. So I'm tempted to call places like Benton Falls happy places in a sort of glib way. But I really see them as places where people are trying to broadcast and inculcate a certain set of ecological virtues. They're kind of stages for the enactment of a drama, in technical terms, a comedy, a hopeful story of resolution, of people coming together with nature and it not being a disaster. Now, it's a happiness that revolves around a perennial bloodbath, okay? There's a tremendous amount of stench and death and scales and everything. But it's a bloodbath that supports a really vibrant, self-determining ecosystem. It's about claiming our stream and having it abundant again, says Tina Wood, who is the head of the group Upstream that I mentioned. She's a local high school art teacher, grew up in the area. She's been advocating for the removal of this dam for many years and using art and public performance and all kinds of stuff in really wonderful ways to do so. It's about claiming our stream and having it abundant again. People are interested in that, and they're fascinated with migration. So when we do nature walks, she tells me, we're standing knee deep in poison ivy by the old dam. We try to include both what happened here historically with the Industrial Revolution. They're insistent that none of those ruins are removed, but also what's happening as nature revives itself. It's so hopeful to see that a stream that was diverted, covered, and dammed 9 times can restore itself and bring life back to the community. How marvelous is that? Bettina uses the words joy and abundance a lot, and she almost always refers to rivers and fish as animate, autonomous beings. And her vision for Cobbossee Stream is unapologetically hopeful, almost utopian. I asked her at the end of that day what people actually gain from feeling joy. And I realized that I asked it in a pretty snarky way. It was implying that maybe they had more important things to worry about. This is not a wealthy area. She said, it makes them well too. I mean, you can't be better than your environment. If your environment is polluted, you can't have a whole life. All right, so joy would typically be placed in a really sad little utilitarian box called cultural ecosystem services by environmental policy folks. But for a growing number of scholars in the environmental humanities and social sciences, it's, I think, seen as a kind of survival strategy. It's essential. So places that cultivate joy, that cultivate moral intimacy with wild things, that function as these stages for the kind of unending drama of rebirth, of death, of consumption, that bring us into closer contact with vast cycles of energy moving up from the ocean and back out again. These are good places, places that we should value, I think. Now, what that kind of moral intimacy looks like is going to vary a lot from cultural setting to cultural setting. Intimacy is very different in Gardner than it is in North Adams, than it is in the UK, than it is in Brazil. I was raised by an anthropologist. This has been hammered into me since the day I was born. One thing that is absolutely the case is that the kind of joy she's talking about is not incompatible with dams. This is Patagonia, the outdoor clothing company. It's the largest and most, I'm not sure what word I'm looking for here. I don't want to sound too critical, but the most avid opponent of dams in the world. And one of their slogans is all dams are dirty. David Brower said much the same thing back in the 60s and 70s. I hate all dams, he said. If you're against a dam, you're for a river. None of the people I've been studying and working with feel that way. They actually really value the area's industrial history. So restoration is not about returning things, or it doesn't have to be about returning things to their natural state. It's actually more like a form of landscape architecture. It's more like maybe regenerative agriculture. And it might seem really frivolous given how scary the world is right now to worry or care about happiness. We should be thinking about survival, not virtue, not beauty. But I think all of us know from our experience in quarantine over the past few years that even the most mundane forms of natural beauty are essential to our lives. They are about survival. So if anything, these really scary times should drive us to ask what forms of life we need to flourish. And I'll just leave you quickly here with a video of the paperboard dam on Cobbessy Stream in Gardner. And a pretty joyful moment in my life. Thank you. All right, I meant to turn on my stopwatch. I hope I didn't go too long.
If you don't mind using the questions here, and then if questions come on this, I'll
Okay, great. Oh, Magnus. I can't recognize him. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Magnus. You know, I when I started working at Williams 12 years ago, my main focus area, the thing I studied was religion, and I still see it everywhere I look. So and it's a big part of this project, as well as trying to kind of understand what we would normally call the spiritual dimensions of environmental thought. So it's an interesting and incontrovertible fact that a lot of the really influential environmental activists of the 20th century came from fundamentalist backgrounds, or came from profoundly conservative, often strangely Presbyterian backgrounds. And there was a kind of apocalyptic flavor to the language surrounding dams, and a deeply iconoclastic Protestant flavor as well. Okay, so you know, John Muir made his name fighting a dam in the Hetch Hetchy Valley outside of San Francisco, and it was all the language of idolatry, and this is a sort of monument to capitalism. And I see that older language of restoration as having a politics that goes along with it that is pretty unsustainable and bad for a lot of people. What I've seen much more evidence of, and I honestly don't hear people talk about restoration that much in these smaller, more urban settings. What I see evidence of is more of an emphasis on reconciliation with the past. And in Maine, as in Massachusetts, a lot of these river restoration programs are being done with the partnership of Indigenous activists who are, building memorials to by the river or by dams to honor the past and the present. There's an emphasis on reconciliation with the Industrial Revolution, with, and an awareness, I think a really mature awareness of how much conflict and violence and exploitation is sort of embodied in this infrastructure. The woman I mentioned towards the end of the presentation, Tina, who's the head of Upstream, really inspired me to start this whole project. Her great-great-great-grandfather, I don't know how many greats, lived upstream on this river and sued the wealthy Kennebec proprietor who lived at the bottom and was building all the dams, and said, you're starving all the farmers and poor people upstream by building these dams. We can't have fish. And that's a really important story that they're trying to tell in their restoration efforts, is that this is, we're trying to kind of undo some of the inequities of the past by restoring these rivers for everybody. Now, it's not a perfect project by any means, but it's different. It has a different theological and moral flavor than I think the forms of restoration that you're talking about. There's nothing MAGA about it at all. And in fact, it's about creating something new. They recognize you can't go back. You can't. In fact, the number of times in my field notes, I wrote down people saying, you can't go back. As for the irreparable harm that dams can cause, you and I have talked about this. We have very few what we would call mega dams in this part of the world. The only ones that are really relevant are up in Quebec, and they're the ones that are providing the green energy to New England and also involve dispossession of Indigenous people. The social costs of dams, in my view, vastly outweigh their ecological costs. Millions and millions of people displaced all over the world, the destruction of so much. So, for me, it's wonderful to see these fish returning, but only insofar as they represent something about a kind of cultural rejuvenation, a sense of hope and pride that people might have in rerouting themselves in a particular location. So does that answer your question?
There are a few coming online.
I can't wait.
So one is from Brittany Messier. Given how your work is upending some of the environmental common sense about dams, I wonder if you could say a bit more about how we might rethink infrastructural interventions, past, present, future, within environmental thinking more broadly.
Love that. So Brittany, imagine what the Purple Valley would look like with windmills on top of every mountain, right? Just everywhere you look is just a ring of white turbines, huge ones. Imagine what all the solar panels that we will have to build will look like. We are, I think, on the cusp of a sort of infrastructural revolution, in the sense that our aesthetic tastes and our ideas of landscape are going to have to evolve really, really quickly. We're going to have to give up. And this is one of the reasons why I find the people in my study inspiring, is that there's no interest in pure wild nature per se, or very little. There's not much interest in thinking in binary terms, infrastructure doesn't belong here, does belong here. In fact, some of the people involved in this group in Gardner are really interested in building more hydroelectric facilities, just doing it in a more sustainable way. So I think that, I study landscape. I think that landscape preferences are evidence of, or some of the most conservative values that we have, and sometimes for good reason. But we're going to have to adapt to thinking about infrastructure, i.e., symbols of modernity, technology, culture writ large, intruding on natural spaces, and the air quotes are there, a lot more than they do right now. And it's about time. We just have to figure out how to live with it. And I say this as someone who is an ardent hiker in wild places with people like my friend Joel here. I love them all, but I think infrastructure is going to have to be much more visible in order for it to be more just.
Okay, well then, here's another one. This is from Jeff Israel. The language of reciprocity might suggest a relationship of mutual obligation. Can a river or ecosystem fail to meet its obligation to us? Can its flourishing impinge on our flourishing? I guess I'm wondering, is there a more duty-oriented element of moral relationship implied in the language of reciprocity, and what would that entail? Thank you, Nick.
Thanks for that really easy question, Jeff. Let's see. I see the value of reciprocity as answering a pretty universal and not very unusual human tendency to anthropomorphize the natural world and non-human beings. There's a whole part of my book about how we perceive rivers as intentional entities and fish as having minds, and something I'm really fascinated by. I don't think you need to adopt any kind of sort of anti-scientific worldview to accept the notion that we have obligations to non-human others. To accept that they have obligations to us is a hard one unless you think that they have souls. And I did choose the term reanimating very deliberately because as a reference to the soul, anima. So I think that there is a struggle perhaps in the secular world to honor what we feel are demands being made on us by non-human beings. And you can see that in the really widespread interest in animism and notions of animacy. Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass, so many people have been inspired by this idea, whether or not it's, can be labeled indigenous or not. I think what Jeff's thinking about is really like mosquitoes and leeches and things like that, we really don't want to have reciprocal relationships with. And also about all the violence and horror and misery that you see in the animal world. I think just learning how to live with it and be around it and see it is a kind of virtue, not putting it in a factory farm somewhere. But rivers, I don't think have duties to us. And I'm gonna yell at you for asking such a difficult question later, Jeff.
So similarly, I'm curious if you think happiness and joy are the same thing in the way you're using them.
No, I don't. But I think of, I'm just using happiness here as a kind of blanket term for a whole range of. In fact, I think of joy as an emotion. And in this account, happiness is a process. It's something that you do, and it doesn't mean you feel good, right? So I mean, I really take seriously the notion that it's living a meaningful, full life. It's not necessarily leading a pleasurable life. Joy is a pleasurable emotion. Not always, actually, can be quite painful. It's interesting. I think when I hear Tina, that's her favorite word, and when I hear her talk about it, it's always in the context of a kind of encounter, a kind of numinous experience, a kind of losing yourself in a place where there are other beings, right? And it might sound very, off the wall, but that's what we garden. That's why people garden. That's why people do fish. That's why they hike. That's why they do all kinds of things. It's just a kind of more elaborate way of putting it, I think. And I think what really worries her is that people don't experience that joy in these places because these places are seen as destroyed, worthless, irredeemable. Thank you. I hadn't actually thought much about joy, even though I talked about it a lot.
Well, you conceptualize happiness.
Yeah. Yeah. There's this whole, debate about whether positive emotions, whether we should really think of flourishing in the Aristotelian sense as for positive emotions being essential to that, because very often people will make this really rigid division and they'll say there's flourishing, which means living a good life, and you could be a miserable flourishing person. And then there's happiness, the way that positive psychology or whatever would talk about it. And the reading that I've done, again, just as a dilettante, suggests that there's a plausible reading of Aristotle that you really do have to have. Joy's got to be in there.
Thinking about the people that you've been interviewing and or talking to and spending time with, and I'm wondering how they arrived at where they are actually. And so, like, I'm thinking about that sentence that you said about how many people said to you, "We can't go back," and how many different ways there would be of saying that. Like, you could say it with resignation, you could say it with sort of loss, or you could say it sort of admittedly. And I guess I'm wondering how their thinking has changed over kind of like, would they have said the same thing 10 years ago, or how they sort of arrived at this. And if there's conflict, if there are differences in this narrative.
There are, for sure. And there are conflicts between the really big, well-funded NGOs like the Nature Conservancy that have invested very heavily in river restoration and are very science-driven and tend to not be great at talking with local communities and fall victim to a lot of that kind of rhetoric of we must liberate the river. The people that I met on the grassroots level kind of get into it often. I mean, a lot of them are, people who boat, who fish, they like nature already. They're into it. Plenty of anglers, some scientists who are just concerned about the ecological health of these rivers. And would they have described it that way 10 years ago? Sarah, tell me more about why you asked that. I'm curious.
I'm thinking about certain narratives in North Africa and how those are changing and how there's different generational investments in stories. And how contested it is. And so I guess I imagine that there's something similar there.
For sure.
I don't really have a reason to ask everything for you.
No, I mean, actually, to me, the really salient differences are between older environmentalists and younger environmentalists and their commitment to the idea of wilderness and of wildness. But so, I mean, here's the thing, I didn't talk about it, I wanted to give a happy talk, but the river restoration is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and in many places, it is not a good thing. It's basically just a gateway to gentrification. in LA, the LA River, you know, when Frank Gehry's designed for the restoration of the LA River is turning into an extremely controversial thing, or has been very controversial. Lots of concerns about dispossession and environmental justice. And it really started as a kind of industry for really like rich guys out west who wanted to fix up their trap streams. And, you know, so there's undoubtedly a history there, and still a strong emphasis. And the Patagonia slide that I showed is sort of emblematic of that. I think, you know, clinging to a notion that like we did everything wrong, we destroyed everything, these mills are a disgrace, we should just erase them from the landscape. And what I'm trying to draw attention to is that there are, in my view, more and more people who don't feel that way, and who also have a much more of a progressive kind of politics where they don't want to see these things just turn into amenities, right? You know, where you can have a nice brew pub up next to the old dam site and watch a fish jump. It's deeper than that. It's about revitalizing some sense that like this area has a future, you know, beyond just cannabis shops and whatever else. So it's not surprisingly, the book is about class. At the end of the day, it's all about class, and it's all about how class shapes people's relationship with landscape. It's free.
Sure. One thing you didn't talk about much was politics on the local scale, and you know the national and international politics. It's pretty easy for us to see. You have a lot of conflicts with organizations like Patagonia and people giving money there to keep people out of places that they themselves will never go, and there are conflicts with local communities there. But I'm curious, especially in Maine, where you have a kind of proto-Trump who with your 2 terms there on the page, and you also have in many parts of the state, as you know well, a much closer dependency on the natural world. You know, people who are, you know, shooting for deer a year and then freezing them and eating them all year, and the same with moose, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm wondering how this is playing out with the politics of those places. Are you seeing those divisions? Is it getting as politicized as everything else, or the local conditions that drive it in ways we wouldn't expect?
Well, both. I mean, yes, it's very politicized. You know, Maine is red, blue, super polarized state, and especially central Maine, where a lot of this industrial infrastructure is. Trying to go back just to show a slide, but it won't let me. So that's the Edwards Dam. That was the first really big one. They're now suing to remove 3 equally large or larger upstream dams to try to restore Atlantic salmon to the river. It's going to end up being one of the biggest political conflicts in Maine. It already is, pretty much. And it's totally lining up as, like, it seems on the outside anyway, you know, conservative people in former mill towns fighting against environmentalists from away, trying to tell them how to run their lives. And that's the case all across New England, really, and it's played out over and over again. It's one of the things that I think they're trying to overcome in this one case study I was talking about. People feel intensely attached to these things. So I visited a small town in Maine where they were about to take out a dam, and a local guy was telling me, this is a tiny little dam. He said, you know why we've been fighting this for 20 years? It's because half the people in this town were conceived behind that dam. Right? There's a swimming hole there. It's like the most important place in this little town. And there are a lot of people in that town are not politically conservative, but they are acutely sensitive to people from outside telling them how to run their lives. My one theory, though, about why Maine has been such, I mean, it's really on a global scale, it's a kind of unbelievable. Like what they've done there is so much more dramatic than anywhere else. And it really has become this kind of at the forefront of river restoration. My theory is that they are able to do it in part because in Maine, people will vote for Bernie Sanders and shoot 4 deer a year and fill their freezers with them. There is an incredible amount of overlap between, there's a big middle, and they're all invested in nature, in hunting, fishing, and they're all extremely proud of what they have in that state. And so it's not as hard to mobilize those feelings, those sentiments there. Whereas in Massachusetts, someone in Maine described the river restoration projects in Massachusetts as boutique restorations. And there isn't that same sense of like, this is who we are, right?
A couple more from the virtual crowd. Maybe I can just club two together. Henry Sachs writes, beautiful talk. Can you tell us anything about how widespread the lovely opinions you quoted are in the Maine Riverside community? Are there people with other views, and if so, are they? I guess partly address that. And then from Chuck Bowler, is joy or happiness more a reconnection to a collective soul rather than a focus on the fulfillment of the soul of the individual human?
I'll start with the second question because it ties directly back to Magnus's question, and it's something that I should have said, which is that there is, and yes, it's not everyone, it's some people. Some people is important. A real kind of discomfort with the individualistic language of the sublime, a sense that nature is not a place to go alone, to venture forth into and to commune with whatever. You know, it's not the John Muir vision of a kind of hyper-Protestant individualistic piety. It's much more communal. It's much more about social solidarity. And people coming together around these places. It's so fascinating to hang out at these spots. I love to go to the Troy Dam in Albany and just hang out. And I'll sort of pretend to fish, but I'm really there to just meet people. And they're incredible gathering places. And they matter tremendously to people. And I think that you know, the people who I'm profiling recognize that. They recognize that there is something about when moving water is compressed and it makes noise and it turns white and it things can't pass it. That as a human being, that's intrinsically interesting. That's a place you want to be. It's where energy condenses. When I was doing research in the UK on similar issues, someone said to me, you know, the biggest problem we have in the river restoration movement is that if you poll people in England, ask them where their favorite place is on a river, they'll all say it's the dams, because they want to go and hear the kind of music of the water. I don't get the sense that it has anything to do with experiencing that in solitude. With the kind of transcendence that comes with being alone in these places. It's about creating something that's a focal point for social solidarity. And I can't say how widespread it is, but it's a lot more widespread than I thought it would be. Yeah.
Yes, I've heard of dams being used to control flooding.
Yeah.
Any like danger for floods occurring?
Yeah, it depends on the place. And I'm not a hydrologist. I've tried to learn about as much river science as I can. Some were built to control flooding, but most were built to either power mills or, in this case, to make it easier for commodities to be moved up and downstream. So this was built by logging interests and ice cutting interests. The Kennebec was one of the largest sources of ice globally in the 19th century, and also of a major corridor for, at one point, the largest timber industry in the world. So the whole idea is you create a kind of reservoir upstream that's easier to navigate. This is the natural head of tide. This is where the ocean's tide would have naturally stopped, which is where a lot of dams are. But to your point about flooding, I mean, this is like right here, and I studiously avoided talking about our local river restoration because I'm really in support of it, but I'm also not an expert. Flood protection matters tremendously, and it's going to matter more and more and more. And one of the things that environmentalists sometimes do not recognize is that when you have enough money to avoid floods, they don't seem like such a big deal. But if you live in a place that's vulnerable, they're the biggest deal of all. And anything that's going to make you more vulnerable is unacceptable. And it's going to be one of the largest environmental justice issues throughout New England, especially in areas like this. As climate change gets worse, people who live in floodplains tend to live in mobile homes. They tend to live in housing that's not well protected from floods, and they're often forgotten. So this is one of the reasons why I think it's so important to not adopt this kind of puritanical logic about, this stuff is bad. We need pure, wild, free nature. In many parts of the world, that's just not true at all. And we need more. We need more hydroelectricity. We need more flood protection, because these rivers are going to be the source of tremendous misery from now on. I mean, they already are to a certain extent, but it's just going to get worse and worse.
Well, on that note, I
Yeah,
think we
sorry.
are out of time. But,
That's another kind of
Yeah, right.
Use the kids catching fish again.
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead, do a little dance.
once again, thanks everyone for being here, and do come next week for Maine, and thanks again to Nicolas.